Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz, and this season we will be unpacking real trends, hot topics in the workplace around allyship and inclusion. Our goal is that each week you leave with tangible tools, information, practical strategies that you can take back to allies at your organization. Let's dig in to this week's topic. Hello, listeners. Oh, this is such a joy for me. I'm fangirling right now because I'm with Kristen Pressner for today's interview. And I first met Kristen's work through her TED Talk, Are You Biased? I Am, along with her Flip It to Test It framework to check unconscious bias as a tool we mention all the time in our workshops, and how to be a better ally and how to manage your bias. And it's just very, very candid. It's very vulnerable. It's a great talk. And she actually has a new talk coming out that we're going to talk about today. And the subject we're going to talk about today is why so many people can't get it together. Kristen is a trailblazing people leader who believes in the potential of each of us. She's the global head of people and culture for a prominent multinational. Her passion for equity and inclusion makes her sought after voice, and she is often featured on international top HR influencers list. She's originally from the US, has spent the last 17 years actually in Switzerland. She's relocated there. And her provocative TEDx talk on unconscious bias opened minds worldwide with its blend of enlightening insights, vulnerability, wisdom, and inspiration. In May 2024, Kristen returned to the TEDx stage to ask the question, what if our understanding of neurodiversity is all wrong? Ah, so exciting to talk about this. So, Kristen, before we dive in and with what we're getting wrong and why people can't get it together, tell us the backstory of your current new talk.
Well, first of all, Julie, I'm equally fangirling. I'm a big fan of your work, probably for at least a decade. And so it's really a pleasure to be here on the show with you all. The background behind the talk. So I'm an HR professional with 25 years of experience. I don't want to sound unhumble, but I think I'm somebody who has a superpower in knowing what potential people have and being able to bring out their full potential. It's why I got into human resources. It's what gets me high. And I was going through the process of also raising my family while I was growing in my 25-year career, 25 plus. And I suddenly realized with my own 4 children in my own house that everything I knew about how to bring out the potential in people didn't work on my own family.
Totally. I can relate to that as a parent of 2.5. I have a bonus 21-year-old, and holy smokes, Kristen. Yeah, it's like you try all the things that work at work. It doesn't always work at home. I have like a disclosure when my talks, like, do not try this at home. I mean, try it, but it's going to work differently than it does at work. So I totally get that, Kristen. So tell us about the inspiration for the new talk. Tell us like what finding that superpower in people and talking about neurodiversity, like why that talk?
Yeah. So, I mean, at its core, there was a period in time where I realized that things, I always use the analogy, Instagram versus reality. The Instagram picture of my family was fabulous, but the reality, a lot left to be desired. I watched as my children could simultaneously achieve great things, and you could see the capability and potential and drive. But at the same time, in our house, a lot of things felt way harder than they had to be. And honestly, I found it baffling. We spent so much time looking for wallets and keys and homework assignments, or racing to meet long since forgotten or procrastinated deadlines. And I came to the conclusion that it almost felt like everybody but me wanted to do things in the hardest mode possible. And over the course of that period, I realized something wasn't right. And as I started to unravel what wasn't right, what I discovered at the end was that my family was neurodivergent. Every single one of them, except for me. I was the odd man out. And what was doubly surprising to me is that neurodivergence didn't look like anything like what I thought it should look like or would look like. And so I thought, wow, here's somebody who, by the nature of my job and my background educationally, probably would have had the best chance of understanding what was going on. And if I missed it, what does that mean for everybody else out there? And so at that point, we embarked on a journey as a family, and I do have permission from my family to share this information in this talk. And we came to the conclusion that if there was anything we could do to make that journey of awareness and discovery and what to do next easier for people than what we experienced, we wanted to do that. So thus the TEDx talk was born.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I can only imagine how surprising that must have been to feel like I'm different than the rest of my family. What's going on? And I don't think neurodivergence is the first place you go in your mind, right? Like that makes sense that you wouldn't have guessed that and would have been surprised. And as a mom of an autistic kiddo, I can empathize. Like it's been a journey. Luckily we have a lot of support and tools around it now, and she's only 3, so it'll be a long journey for us. But I can understand how personal this is and how it builds off of, the foundation you laid with your first talk around bias. Neurodivergence has some bias and microaggressions and misunderstanding about it. What do you wish that people understood more about neurodivergence?
Oh, I love that question so much. And I really answer it from the lens of what do I wish I'd known, right? And I would say first that neurodivergence probably doesn't look like what you think it looks like. And so in its simplest terms, what I would describe what I was seeing was sheer brilliance, tons of potential, amazing capability, like the possibility was endless. And then this kind of failure to launch, this inability to get it over the finish line. The fact that things that I would find to be incredibly hard came easy and naturally to them, but things that I would find and assume to be incredibly easy and simple seemed way harder than they had to be. A couple of examples: staying organized, getting started on things, seeing things all the way through. It was like there wasn't this, I always use the term, there wasn't this learning loop of how to make easy things get more easeful and happen at scale. And so what would I want people to know? At least in my house, my big epiphany was there's a formula for getting to actions. First, you need motivation, and then you need action, and then you can have outcomes. And that formula is pretty much the same for all of us. The question is, what triggers the motivation? And there is an unconscious bias that I uncovered through this, that I held, and that I believe is held at scale by our world, that everyone's motivated by importance. And so if you and I pay our taxes so that we don't get in trouble with the government. We make sure we do our laundry so we have clean clothes to wear. We do what our boss asks so we can keep our job. And this is kind of the obvious undercurrent of what everyone believes the entire world works like. And the reality is, importance is pretty predictable and agreeable. If you and I looked at a list of 10 things, we could probably put them in a similar order of importance. What I realized with my family and with a lot of neurodivergences, they're not really motivated by importance. It doesn't have the same effect on them. They're motivated by interest, whether something's interesting, whether it's personally challenging, whether it's caught their attention. And so what I uncovered was I was beating them over the head with importance related motivators, and it didn't work. And what I realized in the end is, if I changed the way I engaged with them, I could get magic out. But what I had to do was engage with them through the lens of what's interesting to them. And back to that list of 10 things, interest is very individual. It's in the eye of the beholder in any particular moment. And as much as my heart would have loved to have, for my husband and 4 children, found the one unlocking move for all 5 to make life easier for engaging, in the end, what I realized was it's going to be individual in the moment. And that's my job.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, because when you think that's so interesting to think about it, importance, right? It reminds me of like the 2 by 2 matrix, like what's important and urgent, right? Like us consultants, we love 2 by 2s. Like if it's important, urgent, do it first. But yeah, importance is pretty objective. You can get people to kind of clearly align on what's on fire first, but interest, that's totally different. Like you said, it's very individual. And so having to tailor your communication style and how you work with all the members of your family because the interests are all different. I can imagine that's it's a lot of work. I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding about neurodivergence, and I know specifically ADHD, I believe, is the diagnosis that your family shares. And we should mention, neurodivergence is a big umbrella term. There's a lot of things that come into it. At its core, it's cognitive differences, and all brains are cognitively different, but divergent from a neurotypical brain. And I'm using air quotes here, listeners. But I wonder, Kristen, like, because ADHD, the diagnosis rates, like, it's been so fascinating for me because people will tell me, especially when they know I have an autistic child, they're like, wow, it just seems like there's just so many more kids with ADHD, autism. Like, where's this coming from? And my theory on it, and I'd be curious your perspective, is it's always been here. We weren't aware of it. We didn't diagnose it. We institutionalized people. So it's been there, but we've kind of kept it in kind of as a secret off in the sides. Now, I'm really thankful that our kids are growing up in a time when there is a lot more awareness and acceptance and even celebration of these differences because they bring different thinking styles, different ideas, creativity. I mean, there's a ton of positive things that come from neurodivergence. So I just wonder in thinking about the lessons you've had with your family, how do you see this translating to the workplace with neurodivergence and ADHD? Just how do leaders equip themselves? How do they learn about it?
Oh, such a great question. And you're right. I mean, I know there's quite a hot debate out there on the increase in diagnosis of neurodivergence in general. And quite honestly, I remember the first person who suggested to us that that might be what's at play in my family. And I'm like, no way. I mean, I was absolutely shocked that someone could think that the kind of person who could write a term paper with top marks in one last minute 12-hour marathon the night before could possibly be neurodivergent. But it, I think, really reflected my lack of understanding how neurodivergence can manifest. And at the end of the day, and you've mentioned it, there's a continuum that we're all on. And I do think the diagnostic criteria doesn't really help us here because at its simplest form, the diagnostic criteria for something like ADHD, but many other types of neurodivergence, is the level to which it disrupts the person's daily living. And that means, but people, if you're above the line, you get a diagnosis. If you're below the line, you don't have it. But the reality is we're all along a continuum. And so my newfound awareness in this space has led me to understand that if we change the way we engage with people, it would reduce the suffering. And if we can reduce the suffering, then wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to do beyond the walls of my house, but in the world at large? And you asked for contributing factors, and I do think with the increase in diagnosis, and I do think more awareness is a big part of it. But I also think the fourth industrial revolution is a big part of it as well, because back in the day, in the earlier times, I mean, when people were tribal and cavemen and women, etc., the reality is it would have been a competitive advantage to have ADHD, a lot of the superpowers that you see there. And what we've done is through the most recent industrial revolutions is put everyone in boxes at school, in boxes at work, expect people to be able to produce. And it plays to the strengths of some neurotypicals, and it absolutely doesn't play to the strengths of others. And we've written a narrative that they're somehow broken. But I would argue that perhaps we've broken the way we run the world in a way. And so, yes, exactly that. Beyond the walls of my own house, I started to think, whoa, what does this mean for how we engage in our workplaces? And you would ask kind of, how does that translate and what can we do? I like simple, memorable ways of looking at things. And the most impactful thing that we can do is to be curious and non-judgmental, and to recognize that everyone's brains are different, because then this conversation and the outcome that you do in order to address this, it isn't limited to people who have ADHD or neurodiversity. It's just a way humans interact with one another to get the best out of one another. And so to two practitioners who are very passionate about diversity and equity and inclusion, at the end of the day, my call to action is that we become a brain friend, someone who recognizes that everyone's different and is curious and open-minded and wants to find out how I bring out the best in you, and is willing to lift a finger to bring out the best in you, because it makes things better for all of us.
Totally. I love that term, brain friend. And I know it's a hallmark of your new talk. So it's a good way to look at allyship and how to be inclusive and a better friend. So interesting, Kristen, what you said about the Industrial Revolution. I never thought about it that way. It makes a lot of sense that, between how we test in schools and all the things that we do. I was just spending time with a teenager in my local community this weekend, and she was telling me all the stuff she has to do just to make it at school. And she's studying. She had 5 tests last week. She has an essay due this week, another set of exams for all of her subjects. Like, what? Like, when did we make school so like regimented and stressful? It's like we've created this and it's not getting the outcomes either. So something's not right there. But even
Yeah.
the workplace, like you said, it's been so focused on production and getting more out of people and having busy calendar, just like all the things that's really difficult for neurodivergent people. I kind of seeing it through my daughter's eyes, and you've seen it through your family's eyes. Like when I look at her and just like you said, just stay curious and not judgmental. I'm like, maybe she knows. I think she knows a lot more things than like we do. Like, I think there's like things that a lot of things we're going to learn from her experience. But sadly, the conclusion I've come to is that it's not built for her. The world is not built for someone like her. And so, just an everyday occurrence going to a restaurant, like that's just not something we can do right now because she just wants to run around. And at school, there's specific interventions they have to do to make her get through a regular school day where a neurotypical kid will sit and just sit there, which is kind of odd that we expect kids to do that, to be honest.
Indeed. But you're exactly right. I mean, when you said the world's not built for someone like her, and I think, again, as I was looking at this, understanding what was happening with my family, and then you start to broaden the circle and you scale it. What about our schools? What about our sports teams? What about our workplaces? What about our communities? It could feel futile.
Mhm.
Why bother? What can we do? It's too messed up. It's too far gone. And I spent about 5 minutes there and then tried to get in the place of, but what could we do? And the conclusion that I came to was, if I'm neurotypical, then the world that we exist in today was built for me. So I have wind in my back. Something is invisibly making
Yep.
things more easeful for me than others. And they have wind in their face, my family or your daughter, or other individuals like that. It's invisible to the naked eye, but they have wind in their
Yep.
face. And, we in people and culture are familiar with the notion of reasonable accommodations. But at the end of the day, being a brain friend is basically just giving reasonable accommodations. Yeah, there's a limit to what's reasonable. So, I'm not suggesting that, because I think this is where people go, you have to bend over backwards and turn the world upside down and things don't make sense anymore.
Or people get even more like ridiculous, like, oh, we're treating these kids like snowflakes. Like, oh dear, it's like somehow it's
Yeah.
being weak by accommodating people's needs.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting where you went, because, and this is why the title of the talk is provocative on purpose. But I kept asking myself why my family couldn't get it together, and I realized once we realized that they have a diagnosed medical condition that has biological origins, which I won't bore you with here unless you're curious. Like, if my family member had cancer, I wouldn't be like, geez, get it together, and it hit me, based on this massive at scale misunderstanding of how neurodiversity can look, we're diagnosing character flaws. We're deciding that people are lazy, or they can't get it together, or they're not passionate, or don't care, or aren't willing to see it through. And the worst part about it from my perspective beyond that is, so are they.
Right. Right.
And then you think about the huge consequences of basically the feeling that my brain is trying to thwart me from something I'm trying to get done. You start to think I must be broken. And then you get the knock-on topics. 60+% of people with ADHD have comorbidities like depression, anxiety, eating
Yep.
disorders. So we're out of the realm of squirrel, haha, funny. We're in the realm of life or death.
Yep.
And so if you want to be a brain friend, then is it reasonable for you to take a step that helps snowflakes, but now using my own air quotes?
Yes, air quotes. We don't encourage this language, but people say
Exactly.
it, so it's important to call it out.
Exactly. And you had said people say, hey, you're treating people like snowflakes. I mean, I might have thought the same thing, toughen them up, if I have a child who forgets to eat. And for a long time, I was thinking, well, if they get hungry enough, they'll eat. And because that's how I grew up thinking.
Mhm.
And what I realized was, is it reasonable for me to bring a sandwich around dinner time to make sure that they eat so the best of them can come out? And what I experienced in trying this on for size inside my own family is a pretty small individualized intervention on my part of being a brain friend goes a super long way in
Yeah,
bringing out the best in them. And so why wouldn't I? And
right.
if it could go from me to expand to all of us who have wind in our back, so there should be some fuel in there that we can use
Yep.
to make life a little bit more easy for someone else. Like, why wouldn't we? Give me the really good reason why we wouldn't.
Yeah. I love that question. Why not? Like, why wouldn't we provide the level of support that somebody needs? And I've run into this a lot in diversity work, and of course, we're experiencing quite a bit of pushback with DEI in the States right now, which is so weird and a whole nother topic. But it's like, well, I had it tough. They just need to toughen up. Like somehow, because my life was tough, everyone else's needs to be. And it's like, well, if you know what it's like for it to be tough, why would you want that for somebody else, especially
Yeah.
if it's unnecessary? So I love this concept of being a brain friend. Kristen, how can organizations apply this? Because there's one thing to have individual actions, right? But I really think we are at this seismic moment right now. And probably why we're experiencing a lot of pushback in DEI is because we need systems to change. And systems are a lot more complex to change than individual behavior. And of course, collective individual behavior, can create a movement. But I'm just curious as a, head of people for a massive organization, like if you had wishes for what corporate could do better to be more brain friendly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And you had mentioned at the beginning my first TEDx talk, which is around flip it to test it as a mechanism or a framework for recognizing if one might be biased or the situation might be biased. And for me, it was amazing to me how it changed the systemic discussion within my own company and then beyond the walls of my company, because we gave words to call out bias without making the person feel like a terrible person. Which I think is the big challenge with unconscious bias is no one wants to feel bad about themselves. And so you end up having this kind of tough conversation. But if we just have a nice light way of testing and calling it out, then you have a shot at taking action, and that action moving a system and changing the way you systemically behave. And so I think the first thing that I would want to do is, again, if I didn't see it when it was right under my nose, if I didn't have a clue what neurodiversity actually looks like, I was out running around being an advocate as best I could, cluelessly, thinking I understood and thinking I knew, but I'm in my own house, scratching my head, wondering what could possibly be going on. And so I want to get the word out that if you see someone who can't get it together and that baffles you and it doesn't make sense, maybe something else is at play. And if something, because again, I threw everything I had in the book at my family through my importance lens, and it didn't do it didn't move the needle. And then when I realized how to crack the code and that things were in my hands, it did move the needle. And so I had to change my approach. I didn't have to work harder. I actually had to work less hard in the end because I started getting results. And so what I want to do is get the awareness word out that if this is the thing that you're observing, it could be that you're dealing with neurodivergence. And by the way, they might not know. Everyone who's neurodivergent doesn't necessarily know. My family had no clue they were neurodivergent. My husband was in his 40s. And so they might not know either. And so it doesn't matter if there's a diagnosis. We just need to recognize that we're all in different places along a continuum and all address each other from a brain-friendly way, which is knowing that, and then saying, okay, if I'm super curious and non-judgmental, what would I do? Well, a super curious, non-judgmental person asks questions about how you're best optimized, and then I try to live into that. And if we do this in our systems at scale, there's quite the possibility that we could actually shift those systems in a more material way than what feels like beating our heads against the wall right now.
Totally, totally. Like I think about the tweaks that we could make to the systems to make them more accommodating. And by the way, that works better for neurotypical people usually too. It's like,
That's
why
exactly
does
right.
the workday have to be 8 to 5? Like, why do we have to respond to emails right away? Like, is this really healthy for anybody? These expectations. And Kristen, it reminds me of this conversation. When I was a people leader, when I was back in my corporate days, I had my first neurodivergent person that worked for me, and she told me she had ADHD and she was on medication. And it was really interesting because going through this journey as a leader, I remember at first, like, oh, shoot, I don't even know like anything about this, right? And this was 15 years ago when we didn't talk about this stuff. And when I listened to her and what her needs were, it was actually very simple, but it was a lot of the things you're talking about, like a procrastination behavior. If she had to do like a very detail-oriented, like Excel spreadsheet task, like being in the office under fluorescent lights and having everybody noise all around you was like super not helpful to her. So it's like, okay, yeah, go home and do it. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, that's where you work better. Like that's fine with me. And procrastination, we would just have prioritization meetings. It's funny saying what you're sharing because it's kind of what we ended up figuring cobbling together is what was interesting to her. Because if she did things that was interesting first, but not necessarily what I thought was the most important, then she would have energy to knock out the other stuff.
Yeah.
So it's just fascinating what you're talking about. And kind of as I'm ruminating on this, I think a lot of leaders this doesn't have to be super hard. You're going to get more out of people. The workplace, I fully believe, will be more creative, more innovative, like better decisions will be made when we embrace the full potential of all humans. And, a quarter of people have neurodivergence. Like this is a huge part of our labor force. So getting smart about it is just good for business.
Oh,
Um,
so much that, so much that. And Julie, you raised a really good point, and I haven't made this point, and it feels important to me because so far the arc of our conversation sounds like, oh, it's tough for them, so we should make it easier for them. And if I'm an employer, I'm in the background going, hey
right.
man, there's a limit to how much accommodating
Yep.
we can do. We can't just accommodate 25% of the workforce for sport. But what felt really important to me in my discovery was, and here I love to flip it to test it. We talk about neurodivergence, ADHD in this case, through the lens of an importance world. So we say, they're all over the place, they're inconsistent, they're out of control. And I did that. I said, I looked at the downsides of
Yep.
ADHD through the lens of an importance world. But if I flip it to test it and say, not look at things through the importance world, but through the lens of what are their true superpowers, well, then it's not all over the place. It's able to focus on sudden unexpected things.
Mm.
It's not inconsistent, but able to change strategy, try new things, and respond quickly. And it's not out of control, but having a body that's full of drive because
Yep.
it floods easily with adrenaline. And those things, it brings unique thinking. It brings hidden connections that are revealed that the rest of us don't see. It brings being flexible and resilient and quick to master new things and to be intensely imaginative and creative. So there's a metric ton of upside there that any employer should be grateful to have. And if the return on the investment is that for telling someone they can use headphones or do the spreadsheets at home, or you make the order of their work so they get a dopamine hit doing something
Mhm.
interesting before the boring thing, like who cares?
Does it really matter? Like, why are we creating these unnecessary parameters and rules? That's another thing. I love how you just flipped it. So that was so perfect to flip it to test it, which listeners, flipitotestit.com is an awesome website with Kristen's first talk and tools. It's so good. It works so well. And you just did all those kind of negative stereotypes can be easily flipped into positive ones. Agile, yeah, creative, like all these wonderful things that they bring. And because the workplace and all of our systems were designed, by the dominant group to work for the dominant group. It does put that lens on things of thinking about everything from a neurotypical perspective instead of defaulting to what if we thought about it from the other
Yeah.
perspective. So thanks for reining me in on that. I love to finish on a positive note in this conversation, and I've just admired your work for so long. So this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad that you had this. I think what is so unique about you is I think a lot of leaders in corporate are very fearful about admitting their biases, right? Admitting their flaws. Like, I couldn't figure out my family. Like, that's pretty raw stuff, but you really lean into it. And it's such a model for all of us to be like, well, she can admit it. I can admit it too. And so thank you, because that is so important, creating space for other people and other allies in the world. So thankful for your work, Kristen. Tell our listeners how they can engage with you, follow your work, your new TED Talk, all the good stuff.
Thank you, Julie. I'm really touched. I am literally just a person who keeps figuring out. I haven't got it all figured out and wanting to pay my lessons forward. So I appreciate the nice and kind words. So as we're recording this, my talk is not yet out, but you can search for Kristen Pressner on YouTube and you can find both of my talks there. And my big ask to everyone would be, can we each just try to be a brain friend to one another and open up the dialogue in our organizations about neurodiversity, how it looks, and how we can play a role in bringing out the superpowers that are associated with it.
Ah, I love that. Yes. And flipitotest.com, great one for the previous talk. Pressner, Pressner. So two S's there when you're searching for the newest talk as well. Thanks so much, Kristen, for being on the show.
Thank you, Julie. It was great to be here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. My hope is that you walked away with a tangible tool, insight, or information that you can share with other allies on the journey. If you liked this week's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback means a tremendous amount to us. We'll be back next week with another hot topic.